have minutes from the last meeting. Can everybody take a look, review them, and make a motion to accept them or not?
I move we accept the minutes as.
Seconded.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passed. Now I'll turn the meeting over to you, or Max.
All right. I'm just gonna, a real brief overview. This is the review section, and I'm just gonna give a real general overview. And the purpose was to create a review process that was all interrelated, that everyone was working basically from the same page. The code officer, the planner, and the planning board. The difference being, for the most part, that the intricacies of the project would go to different parties. Obviously, the largest, or more complicated, or uses that involved a great deal of public interest would end up at the planning board. And then from a step down from that, the more mundane things would be divided up to the code officer and the planner. The code officer would take, real basic things, like like single-family residential dwellings, accessory structures, things like that. And the planner would take maybe two-family dwellings, some uses that are small, very, or a reoccupancy of one use. A retail goes in, retail goes out, something like that. However, each of those reviewers would work from the same submission list and the same review criteria for the most part. We started to put in a few things that would be applicable just to planning boards, and that may grow. But basically, everyone's gonna be doing the same thing, but the idea is that when someone comes in from a single family, for a single family home, their compliance with performance standards are gonna be fairly limited, because they're not, it's not a commercial activity or things like that. However, if someone's putting in an industrial building, that would be more complex, and it will involve more performance standards, more environmental, concerns and things like that. So that's basically the template. What we still have to decide, which would be 2 meetings from now, is what goes where. So that's a step that we're just looking at the process right now. The one thing that we wanted to bake in here, which was in the comprehensive plan, was to ensure that environmental reviews, particularly pertaining to water quality, was done across the board. And again, we would look for things like stormwater and erosion at all activities, but the level of what each activity may be required to do would be based on, the actual use and the impact. For instance, single-family homes, we would have criteria called low-impact standards that are very, very basic. However, if you're putting in a larger building with a lot of parking area, you're creating a lot of stormwater flow, you would have a higher standard or more complex standards to deal with. So that was a way to make sure everybody was on the same page, because right now, it seems like there's a kind of a separation between what the planning board looks at when they go through a lot of their review versus what may be done by the code officer or the planner. We want to make sure that everybody's on the same page. That's basically the logic for this approach on that.
I have a question on, so if somebody goes and they get kind of the expedited review through Max or whoever, what happens if there's an appeal? Is the appeal like a same process
Oh,
as
yeah.
with the,
Yeah, the ordinance is written that you could appeal a decision of the, the planning board. We'd have to tweak it a bit because they could appeal the final decision of the code officer, planning board, or the town planner. So you would just have to add the town planner's name in
but if it goes through the expedited process, the reality is that people might not be aware of that decision for months.
there. All right, I see what you mean, yeah. So that's a question about, in the planning board, we have a requirement
Right.
for a public hearing. So the question you're raising is, do you want some sort of notification
To
for
the,
the other?
right, that's where
you-
I was
yeah.
ending up
Do
going
you have
to.
any suggestions?
I-
or-
I'm just thinking that if, I don't know.
Yeah.
I think that perhaps there needs to be notification to neighbors.
Yeah.
Well, that's what I was saying. I think abutters need to know, even single family, I could see where someone wants to put an accessory structure close to a property line, and maybe someone says, well, geez, we never surveyed that line, we want to I think, on the one hand, you're right, you don't want a process so convoluted that things should be CO simple or tied up, but I think you want, as you're saying, a level of transparency and alertedness, especially to abutters, so that they at least know what's going on.
Are you saying that you would notify the abutters of the decision?
No,
Final
this would be
decision?
like beforehand.
Before,
Yeah, I mean, I know they
Before-
get
before-
informed
Well,
beforehand,
let-
but then the case goes on and, when the decision comes down, is it just to the person who's applying or are all the, yeah, in other words, if there's an argument going on,
Well,
and then when the final decision is made, there's probably gonna be a couple of people unhappy maybe, so how does that work?
basically, we would review whether or not the ordinance was followed. So someone may not be happy with it,
No,
and they may be
okay.
fine, but if there's no grounds and, if they have no grounds to show that the ordinance wasn't followed or something,
Yeah,
I just, let me, I want to make sure I understand this. The hypothetical would be, you have a building lot that fully conforms, and someone comes in for a building permit for a single-family dwelling, clearly permitted use. What would be the notification process for abutters?
Well, yeah, we have some-
Would there be?
Would there be? Well, that's something we have to talk about.
Right.
Here, let me throw out what some towns do. I don't know if there's a town in Maine that does it, but what some towns do in other states is that they have a placard. You file for a permit, let's just, and before the permit can be granted, you put a sign out in front of your property that says, I'm applying for a building permit to do X, Y, and Z. And it stays there for a certain amount of days. I mean, that works in more dense neighborhoods and things like
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
The other thing is that a notice is sent to a property butters, and that could be a standard letter. Joe Blow at X amount is gonna build a house, and, and you have 5 days to respond or to ask questions. The permit to look at it is on file at the town office. So, I mean, that's probably something that would be more applicable to us,
And I was thinking more of the commercial sense. I mean, somebody's gonna build a house, either it meets the regs or basically it doesn't. But if you have an existing commercial building and you're changing the use and Max deems it to be a lesser use, and so he says, yeah, okay, this is great, you're good, but the neighbors think, this is not a lesser use, this is more intense. That's where I'm thinking that it might come into play.
All right. Well, one of the things we have to remember is that the decision for that is gonna be in the use chart. We're gonna have to specify beforehand, and that's, yeah, I know what you,
I'll give you one example. We have some great neighbors, but they have a non-conforming use that's literally 30 feet off the water. And there's a lot of rules there, and it's very close to our property line. But if, let's say they sold it and someone wanted to do something with that, and let's say to code, they sort of convinced the CEO that it was right, I would still want to know that that was going on, that this non-conforming use was being contemplated, even if they've managed to work within all the rules that's in the shoreline zoning. I think there are issues like that, especially when accessory structures, which is close to someone else's property line.
All right. I have here, commercial, non-conforming issues, changes of use. All right. Are there any other activities that you think should trigger some sort of notification process?
I'm wondering if there can be some type of caveat or in there that says, look, if X number of people come forward in concern or opposition, not necessarily in opposition, but with concerns, that it then has to trigger a public hearing.
That is something that we do have for the small wind farm that I mentioned
Yeah,
last meeting. The CEO has to send out a notification if there's I think the ordinance just says a sizable response, so I guess we need to determine what that means.
Yeah, because I think leaving it up to sizable is
Yeah,
not
that's
good.
not good. Yeah. It has to be measurable, otherwise we get,
Yeah, I mean,
kinda
if
gets
you
capricious
said like
kinda.
20%
Yeah,
or something,
yeah,
you
something
put a
like that.
number in there.
yeah.
What about uses that transgress property lines simply by their nature?
Like,
Sound, light, and pesticides?
Yeah. So kind of take kind of a performance-based view based on the impact for abutting properties.
Yeah,
I
and
mean, you could say traffic too.
yeah, I would not limit it to, immediate abutters, because sound, pesticides, and light can all go way beyond an immediate abutter, depending on how the land falls, or how strong the light is, or the sound, or the wind and the pesticides.
Well, keep in mind too, some of these things will need to be addressed by performance standards. So there has to be some, some standards for lighting, some standards for sound, so it's on that there, but that's a good point.
This seems like I think there's a bit of a danger that if you create a sense of empowerment that isn't real, that you can create a lot of frustration.
Can you give me an example?
Well, I mean, if I was changing the window in my barn and all my neighbors said, I don't really think he should change that window in his barn, I don't want all those people pissed off because I changed the window in my barn. In other words, there needs to be some solid basis that's clearly outside of a rule or bending a rule or already non-compliant. It seems a little bit like we're gonna create false expectations if everybody thinks that everybody has a vote on everything.
But they have, a lot of the phrases in that were specific about nuisance. You know, they weren't saying that it could be ridiculous. They were saying that it had to be sort of thought out and rational in a lot of the things that I read, because I was thinking about the loud music in our neighborhood. And so I read a lot of that stuff on what exactly the regulations said, and they were pretty specific. You wouldn't go in and be, well, you might, but I mean, hopefully, people would not go in with something stupid and say, I don't like the goddamn window, you know? Yeah.
Oh, no, I recognize, in fact, it took a long time for me to start talking because there's something there, but I don't know how to do it either.
Yeah.
And we don't have a design review, so a window would be under the purview of a design review, don't we think?
I just
Right,
picked
yeah.
window
Yeah.
because no one
We
should.
haven't contemplated that in the comp plan for anything like that, other than for like architectural review.
That was just the most trivial thing I could think of at the
Yeah.
moment, but.
But it could be anything.
Yeah.
No, I was thinking within, if I get a permit to build a single-family dwelling of X square feet, the appearance is irrelevant, the way it's set up now.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
And, if you want to start imposing limits. I mean, that's sort of moving toward the concept of for example, a historical district,
Yeah,
where you have to get permission to change the tint of the paint, for example. You know, where I lived in Massachusetts for a while,
Yeah.
Groton, Massachusetts, had that type of and it was a sort of a lot of recrimination, to say the least.
I mean, it works in some areas.
I was on the Old Kings Highway, a Historic District Commission in Cape Cod, and we had,
Oh, in Cape,
we owned
yeah.
the whole
To use that as an example, actually.
north thing, and that's exactly what you're saying, except there, it was necessary.
Yeah,
You had to have people that were architecturally savvy, that knew what colors, the thousands of acceptable Victorian colors, and you'd get a lot of people coming up complaining, but you would carefully explain to them that this was used in 1776 for government buildings or whatever. And the result was that for I don't know how many years, I think the commission was in existence for at least 50 years by the time I was on it. And they saved Route 6A. They saved it, otherwise it would have been all clam shacks and, carnivals. So there's a place for that.
think
But
we
it,
have to
it's a different mood from what you're talking about.
remember that we also have to
Preservation.
get these regs passed before the town.
Yeah.
And we're a town very much full of people, don't tell me what to do with my property. So I think
Yes,
we have to
yeah,
find a
that's-
balance.
Yeah, yes.
What I was addressing in those three examples I gave is that all three of those things affect other people's quality of life and health. Whereas the design of a building presumably wouldn't, unless you're really torn about it, affect someone's quality of life or health. And I totally understand somebody wanting to do what they want to do on their property, but if what they want to do goes far beyond their boundary line into somebody else's property, then I think that's a different thing.
But I think that can be addressed by adding a section. And we have some of those
Yeah,
in here.
we have to look at our performance standards and make sure they're more effective.
I think things like pesticides, there's laws that supersede what we would do anyway, I think, on pesticides going where they were not intended.
Well, we
Only
could be,
if
we could be
somebody
more
cares.
restrictive, not less.
Less, yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
We also have to ask ourselves if we have the capacity to do some of these things. Do we have the local expertise to, because otherwise we would just rely on the state regulations.
I think generally, and I apologize for missing the last meeting again, but there's oftentimes, and I'm anti-pesticides, I think that's probably obvious, but there's lots of rules in the state and I think in the town that relate to making it easy for agriculture. There's just like, you don't have to have permits for greenhouses, there's all kinds of things like that. So that
Yeah.
there's a little bit of an uphill battle on some of those things, particularly as they relate to agriculture.
And people's bees are dying
Yeah,
right now.
yeah,
I know four people.
I'm among, yeah.
Maybe it's an issue, and then I have a question I want to ask you, but maybe it's an issue of notification. Like if someone's gonna,
If you spray your lawn with pesticides, I think you have to put a sign on it.
yeah,
Applicators do, I think.
these are commercial.
I think if an applicator does it.
Yeah.
I don't know if
People,
you have to-
people don't have to though, do they?
I don't know.
No, if you hire
If
somebody.
you hire somebody,
Yeah.
they have to do it,
And they're supposed to be licensed,
Yes.
yeah.
pesticide licenses. But these are performance reviews, not acceptable uses. And
That's right.
I'm bringing up something that's off.
Yeah, the decision for what's acceptable is gonna be in the use chart. And that's something we're gonna do 2 meetings from now.
But things that are acceptable still have to meet performance
Oh,
standards.
absolutely, yeah.
I just
Yeah,
wanted to make sure you
absolutely.
Yeah.
knew that.
I hate to do this, but reading the minutes, was there any discussion of temporary buildings? What it means to be a temporary building and how long it is before it no longer was temporary?
No, not specifically, but that's something that we're gonna have to talk about.
Okay.
Because that comes, the whole issue of agriculture and agriculture-related businesses, but temporary buildings is something, yeah. We don't really define that very well.
I think we say you can't do it without a permit. It used to be, I think, that people, I know some temporary buildings that have been up for years,
Yeah,
and I don't think they were permitted. They aren't mine. But that's not to say that there isn't a time and a place where that's absolutely the perfect solution.
All buildings are temporary until they rot.
Well, that's right. And interesting, the temporary buildings will probably rot last.
Well, let's work backwards on this one for a minute. We already have in there, in the ordinance, in this draft, that if it goes to the planning board, the planning board reviews it, they're gonna have a public hearing, just, we bake it in, they just do it as a matter of course. So then the question becomes for the planner review and the code officer review, if we're gonna have a notification, how do we do it in a way that's not like a public hearing, because it's probably not, that would probably be overkill. So what should we do on some of those things? And I'm kind of thinking, some of the things for the code officer, maybe, maybe we won't, but maybe the planner review. Because the code officer one, we're gonna give them pretty simple things, not simple, but pretty run-of-the-mill. Like if it meets the ordinance or it doesn't, there's very little leeway.
So can you notify the abutters and also put something in the newspaper of a decision?
From the planning board, you mean?
Yeah, if the,
Yeah.
no, not
No,
from the
just
planning board,
not
because
the-
that has its
that has
own
a separate, yeah.
separate thing. I'm saying if it's a planner review, expedited planner review.
Yeah, some towns do that, they put a notice in the paper, that can get to be expensive though.
Yeah.
Does it-
Well, can you build it
And we'll
into
have to
the,
build it into the fee.
I think the more common approach is to notify butters within a certain number of feet of the property. So at least it defines the neighborhood and reaches the people who are likely to be most affected.
That's probably the simplest way of doing it, yeah.
Well-
You can have two standards, one for rural and one for more
Sure.
built-in areas to cover, I'm sorry.
So that notice would, be delivered, you could have a constable do it, I suppose, but by certified mail, regular mail,
First-class mail, typically.
well, but then how do you have evidence that they've received notice?
You don't,
Yeah,
You know-
well, the only way to do it is we would do it, the town would do it.
Right,
And then then we were be assured that,
but,
We could
I'm getting into sort of minutia here,
Yeah.
but,
no, that's a good point though.
I think, I think at a minimum, you'd want a certified mail return receipt requested, so that, and then you would know if somebody hadn't.
Yeah, that can get to be expensive though too. That really gets up there.
Well, it depends how many, of course, how many butter, or how many people are in the affected range, but,
Yeah, if it's a handful, but sometimes I've seen some of them 20 or 30 people.
yeah.
And that could be a couple $100.
Yeah.
Is it possible to have the person applying pay for that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely, yeah. And even if the town did it, they would still pay for it, because we'd have to have a review fee that would cover the cost.
Yeah.
You know,
I mean, that could be a factor in what the fee is.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
I think it's important in that sort of thing to have it be what I call a neutral process. And that is to say, have the town do the sending out of the notice to the property butters within a certain range that's determined by the ordinance or whatever it may be, rather than something coming from the applicant, because that gets really fishy. It gets very difficult. It also can create unnecessary friction. When you don't want friction, you simply want people to be informed and make up their minds about it, whether they think.
that works. I know when, for some environmental permits, the applicant does it.
Yeah,
From
and
the
that's,
state, and that
that's
could
a matter
create
of
some
getting
problems.
No, but, but, I mean, if the town did it, number one, they'd have a routine.
Right.
And, the notice would be a standard notice.
Yeah.
In whatever ease.
I mean, we give the name of the person, the address, what's gonna be done, and their opportunity to view it, on that.
I also think though that, so it doesn't expand and become everything, there has to be a rational use. In other words, the butters, let's say someone has an interior, a major, even a thermal geoengineering, might cost $35,000. That's not really a rational interest for me to know that my neighbor is doing that. It's interior, it may be a little disruption, but it's not rational for me to really care. I think we have to limit this to things where the abutter would logically, reasonably assume to have a rational interest in what their neighbor's doing.
Right.
So it doesn't expand to every last thing the CO
Yeah.
does, because a lot of things the CO does shouldn't affect an abutter.
There's sort of an assumption here that the abutter, I think I'm speaking to what you're saying. I guess under the surface here, we're imagining that the abutter is gonna see some problem with the project that the people who gave the permit didn't. And I'm not saying that couldn't happen, but I think when you say rational, that's kind of what made me think of it, like, okay, under what circumstances would three neighbors?
Well, proximity to property line is one.
Well,
For
that,
example, if my neighbor has a 99-acre lot, which they do, I don't have a rational interest in most of their lot, but when they get within 40 feet or the very legal minimum of my lot, I begin to have a rational interest in what they're doing. And now, it probably is fine what they're gonna do, but it could be that there could be an issue that maybe the CO doesn't really see. and
was it,
aware
but
of.
that's the key point. There's a presumption that the code enforcement officer doesn't know about a problem that you do know about,
But the
which
point-
could be.
What the point is, though, is that when, let's say I get the notice, I go to the CO and I said, you sent me the notice. He says, I'm sorry, Mr. Zausner, here are the rules, this is fine, I see no reason for your objection. That's it. Then I'm done, unless I really wanna go the legal route, that's done, but at least I
Yeah.
have notice.
No, that,
I had transparency, the CO, 99% of the time, the CO is gonna explain to the abutter, I approve this because here are the rules, I explain them to you, they're right, and I'm confident in my judgment.
yeah, no, that's
But-
perfect.
But once in a while, they're gonna say, you know, informally, you may wanna speak to someone, for example, who used to be chair of the planning board, and he'll explain, back me up informally, and if you still wanna go ahead, then you can.
Yeah.
So it's, I'm not
Rational
trying
is
to
the key
create,
word.
I'm not trying to create an adversarial process as much an informational one in those limited circumstances where it's applicable.
I'll
Yep,
give
that
you an
makes sense.
example where that worked well. It's almost 20 years ago when they amended the subdivision, state subdivision ordinance, and it required, when a subdivision plan was first filed, before it even got on the agenda, we're required to send a notice to all property abutters that we've received one, and they can come in and take a look at it. Works wonderful, because for that reason, people come in and
Yeah.
they just wanna know.
Yeah.
Very rarely does, and most of the time that's cut the participation at the public hearings, because they've already seen the plan, answers their question, unless they have an issue, then they, so it works well.
I think you're absolutely right.
So I guess now the next question is how do we, what's gonna trigger this? Because remember, if we, otherwise, we have to be careful that we have to treat everybody equally. So we have two choices, we can be real broad, or we could be very specific. And what's gonna trigger, like, if the proposed addition, because let's say we're not gonna do anything on interior, but if the proposed addition is less than or something, some sort of to the property line or within or something, then that might trigger it. Or if it's a non-conforming issue, non-conforming use to another non-conforming, that's a reasonable.
Those two that you just said, yes, there should be, if there's a minimum of 15 feet in the zoning, but someone's gonna be 21 feet, that's close.
Yeah.
Especially if it's a 99-acre park, So proximity, and if there's impact, if they put a shadow on your property, there's tangible impacts that are kind of undeniable.
Yeah.
That certainly would warrant this. And if you're doing it by letters and not putting it in the newspaper, then it's the cost of a stamp.
Stamp, yeah. What other things? We mentioned commercial, and then you had a lot of quality of life kind of issues, but,
Yeah, those are the only three I can think of that I
Yeah.
have personal experience with, that would, or know people, so that's
Do-
why I mentioned that.
Do we have fairly enforceable and measurable sound limits, sound versus?
That was brought up last meeting.
And I missed it.
We don't have a sound
Meter.
meter.
yeah, we have to work on it.
I have a decibel meter that I downloaded.
Yeah.
Yes. Simple.
Yeah.
Somebody said something here that sort of triggered a thought, something about an additional non-conforming use on a non-conforming use.
Yeah, our ordinance allows a non-conforming use to change to another, potentially another non-conforming use, as long as it is equal to or less than the impact.
Okay, but, so who makes that?
Those automatically go to the planning board, though.
Okay,
So that would, you know, the planner or the code officer would be.
but if you had a non-conforming use and you were gonna, property owner wanted to adopt a non-conforming use that was totally unrelated,
Yeah,
and it would not be allowable in the particular zoning district, wouldn't that go to the Board of Appeals instead? I mean, it would be turned down and then would go to the Board of Appeals?
no, it would, the way we have it work, it would go, the condition is that it has to have a less of an impact than the existing one, or equal to or less. And that's something that the planning board is gonna delve into in terms of
Okay. I mean,
whatever the issues are.
So you cannot have more of a lack of lack of compliance. It has to be less than the injury that would the first approved or okay use
Yeah,
would
yeah.
have.
It's kind of like a practical concern. I mean,
Great.
legally,
So-
we're supposed to eliminate them, but
Yeah.
in the
So,
real world, they're.
sort of an example that did go to the Board of Appeals was Norman Whitehill's garage.
Right across, yeah.
That the ordinance was, the setback that he asked for was about cutting it in half to have his
Right,
garage
yeah,
meet
yep.
it. And
I recall that,
yeah, he outlined, you know, it's a small property, I don't have that much room, so on and so forth. If he wanted to build off that, he still has to meet that setback requirement that was met. If he wants to go closer, then yes, it would go to the Board of Appeals again, because
Right,
he
okay,
needs that new
okay.
variance.
But the use, this is when we're dealing with use, because the Board of Appeals doesn't deal with uses, just dimensional.
Yeah.
Grandfathered, non-conforming lots, just pass on.
Yeah, a non-conforming lot can be used as long as it meets all the dimensional requirement except for lot size and, I think, frontage.
Yep.
So, you know, that you could still use one, but you would have to meet your side setback, your density factor if there's a build-out requirement.
But I mean,
But,
what,
yeah.
if there's a house on a lot that's got not enough road frontage, say it was next door to me,
Yeah, they can build. They would have to meet all the other setbacks.
or that, but that house can change ownership without having.
Oh, yeah,
Yes.
absolutely, yeah.
But like our lot is completely non-conforming, and when we put up a barn, I had to go for a variance
Yeah.
because I couldn't meet the front setback.
Yeah.
Yeah, in that case, yeah. Yeah, this is, we're more centered on uses, though, we're,
Use as opposed to.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes just because of the, you know, design of the building or something like that, it is what it is, and, you know, practically, it limits what can actually happen to certain, you know, spaces or sites or whatever.
So if you look through these regs, I mean, would it just make sense to look through the ones that require planning board and say, hey, look, this requires planning board, but we think we can expedite it, or are we,
What I'd like to do is take a fresh look.
Okay.
Because there's,
yeah,
it's rather capricious
Yeah,
sometimes
okay.
when you look, that we,
But, one might say, at your peril, you can do that.
well, right,
because sometimes, you know, there might have been some logic to,
yeah.
but sometimes it's built up over the years and
Oh, right.
no one knows why.
They kind of grow weirdly.
It's always nice to say, all right, we have, this is our reason,
Okay.
so we can stand, or somebody remembers the reason, you know, on that. Yeah, because actually, sometimes that makes it easier than trying to make it out.
So I have this is completely kind of off the track, sorry.
That's
But, so there is now a lot of property in town that's on conservation easements. Do we have a map that shows that? And the reason I'm asking is because in the town where we go in the winter time, there's a huge lawsuit because the CEO approved some lots and didn't have the historical knowledge to know that they were in conservation easement and they couldn't be built on. and now there's like this ridiculous, enormous lawsuit. And so, I think that's something that the town needs to see.
Yeah, there's some of the larger parcels that we have mapped. However, there could be a deed restriction that prohibits, that we're not privy to, you know? And this happens a lot with very simple projects. You know, we have no clue, and that's.
Well, that's more of a civil thing, isn't it?
Yeah,
But
That's exactly what it is,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
But I was thinking the conservation land is town issue, so.
Well, it may be, it may not be.
Oh,
It
okay.
could be, you know, anybody could put some limitations on your land. Or you could say, you know, I don't want anybody to build, you know,
Right.
and that's fine. But then the question is who enforces it?
Okay.
If it's something that the planning board imposes, like in a subdivision review, it says, you know, sometimes you see subdivision plans, they have a building footprint area. And, you know, that's where you could put the building. And that's something we can enforce if it's on the plat imposed by the town. All right, so we have non-conforming, which may be property line issues. How do we handle the quality of life things? What are we gonna, I mean, we could say, you know, commercial activities, in the hope that that covers, that those would be the activities that would presumably may deal with traffic noise, sound, you know, I mean, for the most part on that.
The things you can measure are light and dark, sound. Is there anybody who's ever measured smell in a way that you could?
Actually,
It's in the eyes, or the nose of the beholder.
Okay.
Well, but this gets back to farming.
some people were very sensitive.
This
Or
gets
bait
back into
issues.
farming. What?
Bait issues.
But I mean, but that definitely
That becomes a problem.
transgresses borders.
I
And
mean,
I
we
make
could
smell,
test
so I'm
for-
kinda
You're
stupid.
talking about the
Gas.
50 head of cattle next door to you?
Do I have 50 yet? Not yet.
No, but I mean, that would be
Yeah.
olfactory offensive to some people. Other people who grew up with it wouldn't bother them at all.
We
Well,
just
that's-
have the 10 barrels of bait next to us.
Yeah, there you go. Oh.
If there's pesticide transgression on property that, I think I remember, I'm trying to remember this, on property that's been organic certified, there's a whole series of people to call and processes.
That should be a serious civil
Yeah,
issue.
there's a whole
Yeah,
series
right.
of things that happen then. But, for somebody that's like just an ordinary homeowner that has beehives, and the bees die, and they call in the state and wanna know why the bees died, and they say, oh, well, the property next to you was leased and they spread all these pesticides.
Well, you don't have to have bees, all you do is have kids, or maybe your
Right.
mother.
Yeah, but this is the example that I know. I was wondering if, okay, so if you lease your land or, use your land for somebody that is probably a commercial grower and has reason to spread, they think they have reason to spread pesticide all over, wouldn't that be a situation where the abutters and however far out, need to be notified ahead of time?
There must be some, what does the state, what role does the state play in this?
I don't know, I should, but I don't.
I know, I feel I should too, but
I mean, there are regulations
Yeah.
for, and I'm thinking about this, because I'm not sure locally we have the expertise.
Well, chemical drift, I mean, that's a
Yeah,
real
I mean,
thing.
Yeah,
It is a
we
big
just
deal.
don't have the
Yeah.
access to the talent, the scientists, the expertise to.
No, and you can address it if they come in as a new business saying they have to meet state.
Yeah.
But
I-
who
I
would know whether they are, I mean.
I would think that in a practical situation, if it was the practice of a particular property owner to be doing that my thought is that the abutters or people in the neighborhood might want to hire a testing outfit that was equipped and qualified to make, to assess the nature of what was going on there. I mean, if the air, obviously, I mean, you wouldn't have to go on the property, which would be a transgression. But, you know, if you're right in the neighborhood, holding up some meters that tell you what levels of various pollutants are in the air. But that would really not, I don't think that would fall within the towns. I mean, that would really be a.
But the EPA, if it's pesticide, it'd be EPA.
EPA, exactly, it would be an EPA violation.
And there's rules,
but-
here, okay, here's an interesting tension,
Yeah,
I think. If I'm a farmer, a grower of something, and I'm using properly registered pesticides, and I'm using them properly in accordance with all the rules, and they are necessary for me to make my living with carrots, you get a real tension if the grower is in compliance and a neighbor is measuring levels. In other words, I'm not sure, there'd have to be a coordination of something there.
oh, I'm not disagreeing, I think you're absolutely right, but that, you know, certain, if the air is gonna be tested, it has to be done by a qualified
Right.
tester, it has to be done under certain conditions and so forth and so on.
And one of those conditions would have to be time.
You're right.
So it seems like it would be better if people were notified ahead of the application.
Well, there's another issue here too, and this happens with sound in particular, is that the best way to address sound is to design your site and building to mitigate the sound before, before doing it after, then it's a disaster. So we can apply the same thing here too, is that if a person is going to involve, if their activity involves pesticide or chemical use, we're gonna wanna know beforehand how they're gonna do it, et cetera, and if they're in compliance. So we can easily do that, because they can go to a state agency or the federal government and say, this is what I'm gonna do, is this in compliance? And then we know it's fine.
I don't, is there a part of the process where that carrot grower is obliged to come to the town office? I don't think so.
Not for agriculture, no. But for other activity, it could be a paint spray booth.
Yeah, no,
I
I'm
mean,
just,
there's a lot of,
yeah.
you know, there's a lot of things that
It
overlap.
gets very tricky, especially when you're blocking horns, so to speak, with
Yeah.
agricultural activities.
Yeah, yeah, they're, you know,
And the other thing is, if you're, one situation is where this outfit is leasing property from, they don't even live in, their business isn't even in town, but they're leasing property from residents in Waldeboro. Does that add another layer of distance from it?
no, Steve, if whomever's doing the activity, whether the owner.
There's licensed applicators for pesticides.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, the same thing if a contractor violates some dimensional standard, we hold them accountable as much as the property owner,
So-
just as an example.
I just have to say this, but this wouldn't be a problem at all if we banned pesticides. Which we're losing insects and birds really quickly, and bees.
The EPA is debating whether seaweed extract is a pesticide right now, so I have some sensitivity to this
Seaweed
subject.
extract is a pesticide?
If you label it certain ways, it becomes a pesticide.
Oh,
The
wow.
same stuff that you could drink. So,
It's getting, that's on everybody's minds these days with pollution. It's everywhere. And I just saw a story in the newspaper the other day, and I don't remember the name of the pond. It was a pond in Maine. And I'm thinking that there's so much land still under rural use, or even not rural use, gardeners, just homeowners that are very conscious of what's going on and affecting global warming. But this pond was a favorite of kids. I remember as a kid going to feed the ducks, and it was a favorite of local kids. And they would go for years and years and years feeding the ducks. And one of the scientists came out and said, please don't do that anymore, because the bread floats and it has so many enzymes or whatever it is that it has in it. And it lines the edges of the ponds and starts affecting the greenery, which the ducks feast on. But when the ducks eat the bread, they poop, and the poop also settles on the walls, and there's no stopping it. And so, by degrees, the pond has gotten more and more polluted. And it was millions of dollars to try and clean it. So that's the kind of thing that we're hearing all the time, I think, that, you know, as Sarah was saying, that the bees, the insects, the birds, et cetera, it's affecting them. So it's maybe not directly in our purview, but if we know it's happening, and at least we should probably be thinking about, is there something, some way that we can make people conscious of it when they come up with a plan, like you're saying, with, you know, loads and loads of agricultural pesticides that are legal, but we still don't know 5 years down the road what their effect will be. Maybe they'll be terrific,
I think.
maybe they won't.
I think you can tell where my heart is
Yeah.
on the subject, but there's bounds on what the town and the people in the town can do
Yeah.
when it comes up against federal or state
Yeah.
regulations. As you say, we can be stricter, but it's a tightrope we're on here if you
Yeah.
start.
But if we're
Trying to-
conscious of it,
Yeah,
you know,
we
there
all
can
should
be
conscious of it,
recommendations
yeah.
made,
Well,
let's say,
yeah.
or,
You know, on the one hand, you want to restrict or mitigate these kinds of issues as far as possible. On the other hand, one of the other things we're trying to do, I think, is to make this municipality a place that is not, you know, piled up with red tape for business to come in. Because we're trying to, this couples with economic development, so there's kind of a tension there.
yeah, there is everywhere.
And you know, so,
Yeah, there's a if your performance standards are clear and, you know.
Yes,
then
exactly.
everybody knows beforehand.
that's right,
And that makes a big difference.
that's right.
Yeah.
I mean,
And then you can, the developer can assess the cost of moving forward. I know I have to do this or that, and, you know, and there's some predictability there.
yes, I mean, otherwise, you know, a prospective entrepreneur looking here might see endless back and forth as to what can be done, and you know, go find some other place.
There's a company that's is going to grow eels right over here in the business park. And they went through a very expensive, very structured approval process, and then ended up with the state and the water and all the different constraints. It's a 27,000 square foot building that they've got permitted, and it went through this system of the planning board, and they were properly prepared, and it was beautiful.
Yep,
So we were welcoming in that sense,
yes,
Yeah.
and it was important. I mean,
Yes,
it's-
because
Yeah.
everybody, yeah, they knew, well, they had good engineers,
Yeah,
you know, they
they
knew exactly what they
spent a lot of
had
money
to
to
do.
get that presentation ready.
Brings us to the point, do we have, or can we create the checklist that is,
Yeah,
so that there's no wavering, it's just like boom, boom, boom?
yeah. Yeah, we, you know, there's ordinance language we put, but for a practical matter, there'll be a checklist, and everybody will use the same checklist. So you just divvy it off, and you know that you're covered. So it gives you an opportunity to ask the question, is there conservation easements on the property? And typically, we're looking for, you know, the bigger ones, but it opens up a question. You know, does it, you know, is something else on the deed, a lordship maybe?
Could I take a slightly, or maybe change the subject here a little bit? It seems to me that you could either define, you know, where each particular use would fall in the three-tier range, or, and that would be very time-consuming in terms of developing an amended zoning bylaw. How about if the planning board could delegate that? You know, provide that, and that way you'd get into much less detail. And that would be something that could, that review process could be revised from time to time by the planning board, depending, as you know, based on experience.
Well, it should be, there should be, some towns will do an annual, you know, they just bake in every year, they, you know, the first of the year or something like that, they take a look and say, do we need to make any changes or updates, you know, in our ordinance, for that very reason on that.
I mean, maybe the planning board wouldn't want to be given that discretion.
Well, you have to change the ordinance, it has to go through the whole process of the town meeting voting on it, et cetera.
No, but I'm saying if you had an ordinance or bylaw that, you know, grants this authority to determine the level of
Oh,
review
yeah.
by the planning board,
Yeah,
that would simplify, revising this.
that would be kind of problematic, though, because.
Might be,
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
I just-
we
I
have
was-
to specify in the ordinance exactly.
I'm not sure when the last time had one of these committees was formed, but I was on it. And I was an advocate for, we had a great planning board at the time, as a matter of fact. And not that we haven't always, but we had a
I was gonna say,
particularly
have
great
one
planning
member
board.
sitting right there.
But the point is that I had, as a member of the committee, I had every confidence that the planning board had, as a group certainly, and if not individually, had, their discretion was not being used enough. We were trying to micromanage and pre-predict everything that would possibly
Yeah,
happen. And so I was an advocate for leaving discretion there. And I don't know if it was the county planner or somebody, but that got shot down. And in
Yeah.
hindsight, I can see that you really do need to have,
Okay,
just because it's so easy to have it appear that he got a good deal and I didn't.
Yeah, there has to be that equitable
Yeah.
fair. What we'll do practically when we do that section, Max and I will take the planning boards and put it in and the code officer, which are the easy ones to do, and then we'll leave the middle one blank, you know. Everything could, you know, just
That's where
to
they are,
start,
yeah,
you know.
yeah,
I think one thing that I would think would be very helpful, if it, maybe it already happens, is if the code officer, just as a matter of process, and was to go to, an annually, the DEP, state puts on seminars for, I think it's all through the DEP, to inform code officers what changes have occurred in the environmental rules and laws. And so, I mean, I think it works most expediently, this whole planning review process, if the code officer really is a clearinghouse for any application. And that, then he or she should be equipped to, with red, green, and yellow lights, and looking through it to see if there's anything that triggers a potential reason for the application to require, approval through the state.
I mean, looking at the notes, I think it was something you said at the last meeting. I remember we were talking about muffin factories, and it was ranging from something that you make 2 dozen a day in your kitchen to Nissan putting up a building. So it didn't do any good to put in muffin baking. But the idea that a business grows and becomes more impactful, is there something that triggers a revisitation to that?
Yeah, I mean, we have home occupation, a cottage industry, and then the regular commercial.
But are there numbers or something you can measure to
Yeah.
determine when it jumps?
Yeah, the home occupation is, paraphrasing, it takes place in the home, limited retail, limited number of employees, doesn't change the character. Cottage industry is a step above, and there are some limitations. And then you have the regular commercial.
And at that point, it can get,
Yeah,
Big.
then you would, and that happens frequently. People outgrow,
Yeah.
the business grows or changes, and they need new space or something like that. And there are some issues where a home occupation kind of creeps, and then, it gets a little larger, and people aren't maybe ready to move on yet. But then, there's usually some complaint about something.
so basically a complaint might trigger
Yeah.
a reconsideration.
But a lot of times the people are aware of it,
Yeah,
because they might need more employees.
or they might need a bigger building.
Bigger building.
Okay, all right, thanks.
There's more trucks bringing product or something like that.
Do you keep track of I'm sure you do, keep track of the applications that come in? It'd be interesting to hear from you, like over the past year, which ones you think could have been dealt in-house.
So every application that comes in, There are always two copies that I have. There is the one physical copy that's in the folder bin that's in the back, that's in the site plan section of the filing cabinet. And then I put them on the, I put a digital copy on the H drive of the town computer system, just in their address file. So I do have, and then the documents should be online as well, but those aren't the signed copies ones.
No, I'm just wondering what, if you can say 6 came in last year that you thought you could have handled in-house as opposed to going to the planning
think-
board.
I mean, I think the example that, it was brought up by the planning board that is an easy one to point to was, Cornerstone Financial, they're
Oh,
at the
yeah.
top,
Mhm.
Used to be the restaurant.
Yeah.
it used to be the restaurant, yeah. They were going from a restaurant to an office, change of use to, you know, a planning board item that was gonna need planning board approval, but an office needing planning board approval on Route 1 is what we're looking at each other like, why do they have to be here for this? Especially when they went from restaurant to office.
Yeah, all the
Freeman, were you gonna
impacts
say
are
Right.
much lower.
Yeah.
So, but,
Yeah.
so we're not talking, we're talking a handful each year.
Hardly any,
something?
I think.
How many applications we had?
No, I mean, hardly any came before the planning board that probably maybe didn't need to.
Some of the towers,
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah,
they weren't expansions, they added an antennae.
yeah, like
There weren't
even,
height differences.
like
There was
even
some-
this upcoming planning board meeting, the only application we have is for AT&T to put 3 new antennas on the existing tower at the top of the hill. And
For us, if it's not an increase in height, we just want to know that the pole or the structure can handle the new antennae. And sometimes they just replace them.
Yep.
Yeah, so.
So it wasn't a new tower, it was
No, it's
just
just,
new
yeah.
antennas.
No,
There's an
but the
addition-
ordinance does say if you're,
I think-
if you're amending it.
So I think that we need to start with
Yep.
the past ones and
Yeah.
perhaps work from there.
We also have cases where sometimes we're triggering a business goes out and another business goes in. And sometimes, just the way it's classified, it has to go, it gets a higher level of review where there's really no difference in the activity. Now, there would be things that, you know, where it's legitimate if, you know, because of traffic or something like that, they might trigger, you know, a more sophisticated review. There was another one too that came,
Another,
yeah, I can't remember what it was. Might have been from another town, I'm just thinking of.
well, I mean, the other thing is, if you're asking my personal opinion, I wouldn't have had, the food trucks come to the planning board, because again, they're on Route 1, or at least, Delano Seafood, I don't know why I keep pronouncing it like that, but Delano Seafood, I wouldn't have had come to the planning board,
They
because.
didn't come to the planning board, did they? No.
Yeah, he did. Delano Seafood,
I must have missed that meeting. so-
Because you did Ollie's too, or
yeah,
Olive.
because
I
we also
remember
did
that
all.
one. I remember that one.
I mean, that's just that's just my personal thing. They're not like Moody's, they're not building a new thing, it's a seasonal restaurants. That's something I don't think needed planning board approval,
Because you still looked at the parking and you
we still looked, yeah,
had the
looked
traffic flow and.
at the parking,
Yeah.
look at the specific requirements, but I'm saying like, if food trucks was to become its own category, I wouldn't put a seasonal thing going, any seasonal business I probably wouldn't consider going to the planning board, cause some are more time restrictive, but again, that's my opinion, Bill's probably gonna be,
Well, no, we may have a trigger on that and say, that's fine, but if the traffic count goes to a certain level,
yeah.
then we would bump it up
Yeah,
Or if
'cause
they
I
wanna
bet
go year round.
year round, yeah.
Wiscasset would like to review Red's
Yeah,
Eats
yeah,
again,
yeah,
I'm
yeah,
sure.
yeah, right. Oh,
'Cause, I mean,
So would
some-
everybody in Maine.
Yeah,
Right.
because sometimes the biggest impact comes from like Dunkin' Donuts or
Mhm.
some of those gas and goes,
Mm.
because, you know, just the volume
Yeah.
of traffic that moves in and out. All right, so I don't want to belabor this point anymore, but it was mentioned at the end of the last meeting that at least if for the planner review, have a trigger in there that, at the discretion of the planner, he or she may bump it to the planning board, some wiggle room.
I think Barbara also brought up if the planning board thinks it needs, if the planning board also believes it should go to the planning board, which I think that kind of defeats
Yeah, I think
the
should be,
purpose.
yeah.
Plus it screws up the chronological order.
Yeah.
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 I
I
think
mean,
somebody has to make that decision
I,
at the beginning. so.
I would, as a compromise, and again, this can be something to discuss, I would throw in, instead of the entire planning board, the chair of the planning board.
Yeah, I don't know if I
Well,
would,
I,
that gets
I think,
capricious.
I don't know, we've done permitting all over the state one time or another. Normally, the code officer is the gatekeeper, period. So that you have one person you go into, and that person is, is gonna say, you go to this slot or you go to that slot, because it's this or it's that. And then you don't have people, competing for the opportunity to give somebody grief. It's just a very straightforward, down the road process.
Max, how many times does it come up that an application isn't exactly black and white, like what John's talking?
Based on what, like, the planning board has had since Bill and I have been here, what would be, I think Topsail Farm is the best example we've had, because that was initially,
Yeah, that was.
that was initially that was initially, well, that was initially for like agriculture-related business, but they had.
Undefined.
Yeah, but there were other elements
Yeah.
they were doing that did need to be addressed, like their campground portion.
So, if you're faced with an application that's not exactly black and white, there's some little
Yep.
gray area in there, how do you make that decision? Do you talk to Stan, or?
Yep, I talked with the code
Okay.
enforcement officer, well, I talked with Bill first, actually. Talked to Stan, and then if like there's still a deadlock, that we then talk to Julie to get her opinion on that as well.
So you've set up your own check and balance system.
Yep.
Does that need to be in writing somewhere? I mean, maybe not so specific, to be so rigid, but just like the planner, is encouraged to consult.
I think it should, if I can butt in, it usually should be more specific, because somebody comes into town, they want approval. You want to be able to take a look at a piece of paper and said, any incoming application goes to
This person.
normally the code office. That's the first stop, and from there there's a town planner involved. The town planner is advisory but doesn't sign his name on anything. It's the code officer who really has the power.
But that's already
And
in
who
place.
issues the permit at the
Yeah,
end.
and it was, so
So,
so
yeah.
you leave it as it is, and
We had that on the Cape too, and if someone applied, there was like a sheet of paper that they got that described the process. You go to this person, they give you this,
right.
and they will advise you,
Yeah.
if it's the code officer, they will advise you. You are probably going to want to
Talk to this.
do this, or you're probably gonna
Right.
wind up the planning board, because the
absolutely.
code officer is gonna have some sense of,
Yeah, but
where they're gonna go.
the code, it really is the code officer's legal responsibility. That's what I'm talking to.
yeah,
As an architect, I don't care whose signature I have on something, but the number one that I have to have is the code officer,
yeah.
Yeah,
But I think they need to know that there is a process there
Oh,
too.
yeah.
Yeah.
We
Oh,
have
for
that,
sure. Yeah.
because you
Yeah.
wrote that
Yeah.
thing
Yeah.
up,
Yeah.
remember?
Yeah, which will have to be amended after this.
Yeah.
yeah.
That's kind of why I wanted to hold that off until all this.
Is there anything else we need to? We have some changes to make. Our next step would be to, we're going to next delve into some performance standards that we need to, we'll get some samples out for that, and then the meeting after that, we'll tackle the use chart.
That's when we have to bring the puppy to calm people down.
We're building up to it.
When you're saying performance standards, are you talking about the general ones or the
Well, we're gonna do
specific ones?
just some, we're not gonna do all of them, but some of the specific ones that we identify, noise, sound, agriculture, event venues,
So-
things that we haven't really spent a lot of time on.
So ones that are in Article.
Yeah, the, kind of like the hot button ones, and then we'll do the use chart, and then we'll, and then our next meeting after that, we'll start going through the other items too, to see where we need to update. Because one of the things that we're going to do too is, we're gonna have a separate subdivision ordinance in here, just dealing with subdivisions, because right now, they're blended together.
Oh, I was gonna bring
You're gonna
that up, I have
yeah.
notes on that.
Are you saying you're splitting, if I understood it, you were going to split those sections?
Yeah, we're gonna split
Okay.
the subdivision out from the, because it's a different process, and there's a lot of notifications different that are different.
Yeah, one
It
seems a
just
lot
gets
easier
kind of-
than the other.
Yeah, because, well, they're two different.
I mean, less
animals.
complicated, let's
Yeah.
put it that way.
Well, they can be both complicated,
Yeah.
but they're, you know, you're different paths of
And-
review and,
We need to, the shoreland zoning also probably, it's
Yeah.
in here, but it might also need to be a separate thing that you can just hand to homeowners.
yeah, there's some things that, well, one of the things that we're gonna do is, there was a lot of talk in the comp plan about doing a comprehensive water quality. And so the idea was to, in one section, it'd be a performance standard that dealt with all those issues in one section. Stormwater erosion, you know, activities, the placement of certain activities near water bodies, et cetera. So some of that that's in shoreline zoning now will probably come out of that and go into this.
Yeah,
know,
can
on
you,
that.
can you be specific when you say exactly what we're going to look at? Because I have trouble following this.
Finding
Well,
that.
one of the things that are, yeah, that's, one of the things that.
Am I supposed to have
the-
trouble?
The performance standards that we're gonna be handing out are all relatively new.
Okay,
So that you're not gonna find them,
okay.
you know, in that body.
There is stuff here, but
New-
it doesn't
new
seem
record.
to be all,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah, there
it's
might
kind
be
of
bits and
all over
pieces.
The
the
ones we're
place.
gonna be going through are gonna be in the general performance one, but
Okay.
we'll send out
Yeah,
a notice.
because we decided not to meet in August, so.
Yeah, so,
Okay, I hate to do this. I came from a meeting, the reason haven't had my supper yet, is I came from a meeting in Augusta where we were talking about who owns the seaweed in the intertidal zone.
Oh, yeah.
If, depending on which way the thing goes, when they finally settle down on some regulations, potentially rockweed in someone's intertidal zone, if it was harvested commercially, becomes a commercial activity of the landowner.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Because they would get
Compensated,
compensated.
Compensated for it.
Good point.
or they could,
Whoa.
Well,
Yeah.
okay.
Can I,
not to mention everybody's taxes going wackos, but
Yeah.
anyway.
Yeah, they should increase.
when you're talking about seaweed or rockweed, it's only the stuff that's adhered. If the seaweed comes loose and washes up on shore, that's a whole different thing, right?
Well, less so now than it used to be. Historically, if it washed up, it belonged to whoever land it washed up on. The recent court ruling, which is all, not to get editorial here, but it's impossible to consider implementing, when it's still attached to the rock, it would also be the landowners.
Right. That's what that case said, yeah.
Yeah, it's completely impossible to consider enforcing, partly because the ruling reflects only above mean low water. And how do you know, how do you mark boundaries in
Right.
8 feet of water?
Yeah.
Right.
Well, anyway.
How do you assess the resource?
Well,
We can find a way to do that.
yeah, but, and as soon as you define, you can't
Yeah.
define the boundaries of someone's intertidal zone
Yeah.
without actually
Yeah.
defining mean low water.
Right.
Yeah.
So now you have a closed rectangle you can calculate the acreage inside of for the first time. As soon as you define mean low water, you have a rectangle with,
Yeah, oh, yeah.
with an
Yeah.
area.
That makes sense.
I have a question about,
But anyway, the idea of commercial activity in the intertidal zone, I hadn't thought about it till just this moment, but I think we have to.
The state's gonna have to jump in on that,
Yeah.
on that there. I
But
mean, that should be covered under shoreline zoning.
Okay, so which means we wouldn't really have a say in it unless we were trying to be stricter.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Okay,
we're gonna have to look at some guidance, how to figure that out.
They're probably trying to figure it out right about now.
that's why I was
Yeah.
late. No way, I mean, it's,
And things can change here,
Imponderable.
too. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. On page 4.6, under lighting and glare, it says direct or indirect illumination shall not exceed 5/10 foot candles upon abutting residential properties. I think that there are bigger lights now than there were when this was written.
We're gonna redo that section.
That is off by several decimal places.
Yeah.
So that's what I thought.
Yeah, that's,
And does the town have a meter for,
Light.
lumen,
Lumens.
yeah, for like hitting something to register or record it?
Hitting the ground
Yeah.
is generally, what's a light meter, if you're if you have a limit of, say, 400 foot candles, I'm talking about a shopping center, not a residence. You don't hold the thing up to the light, you hold it down at the ground, and it bounces back, and that's what you read. You know, you could get, 2,000 foot candles if you held it up at the source.
yeah, we're gonna do that, and the sound, too. We have to. But again, we're focused on how it's designed in the first place, not after the fact. So, we're not gonna meet in August? That was a consensus?
Unless anyone has any objections.
I'm perfectly happy to not meet.
I thought it was loosely mentioned, but nobody really wanted to be the one to say.
Well, I think
Why aren't we?
it was said last month, but we said we should just wait until July's meeting to say that, because
And that's for the planning board too, right?
that I don't know either.
Do we
Why
have enough
did-
time to cover everything we need if we don't
I
meet in
know,
August?
I didn't understand why we're not meeting. If a couple of people can't meet, why would, or is it everybody?
Again, I don't know. I just heard cancel
Yeah, we're
in
just
August. and-
Somebody sort of floated that, I
Yeah,
think.
Barbara
Yeah.
mentioned it, and
But, I
She was
mean,
gonna be
seemed like
away
there
or
was a lot
something.
of-
how many people who are present are going to be away?
Can somebody tell me the date,
Uh,
August?
next
Uh,
month, it would be,
The second Monday?
I don't have my.
Do you have a calendar?
I think it's around the 11th or 12th,
Something.
maybe?
Yeah.
Third
I hope to be
I don't
away.
think I have a conflict.
It's up to the committee. We just, when somebody mentioned it, there seemed to be
The
this
12th.
overwhelming.
12th?
Oh, yeah.
12th is the second Monday.
I don't like to lose track.
What,
The 12th is the
yeah,
second.
that's,
Okay,
that's,
you know.
I think it's the
Yeah,
12th.
that was
If everybody-
only my
I don't know.
concern is
I,
about,
you know,
you
We
know,
should
need
be
to have a
okay if
quorum,
we
though.
do, but it's up to,
I mean,
it's up to
it's,
the committee's decision. We can meet if you want.
I mean,
There's not-
10
Do we have quorum requirements?
Yeah,
I
that's what I
mean,
was
10
thinking.
person, we're a 10-person committee,
Yeah,
if I recall.
So
So
we
we
need
need
Six.
6 people,
six
Six.
people, yeah.
which I
Which-
think.
Which is what we have right now.
Four. Yeah, we have 6 tonight.
Sure.
Well,
Really,
Uh,
we've got 9
Sue.
now.
Hmm?
Right? We've got 9 today.
No, well.
no, Bill and I don't have.
Oh,
And,
well, then we got 7.
Yeah.
no, that just,
We'll meet then.
I
Is that the
think we should
consensus?
just
Meet?
meet. I'd be,
Yeah.
I'd rather meet.
Yeah.
Why
The
don't
12th.
we
I think it's
you wanna
all-
take a vote?
12.
I mean, yeah, do you wanna take a vote?
Yeah.
Yeah, if people want to do a vote, they can.
I move we meet on August 12th as usual.
Second.
Second.
All right, we didn't pass out that material because we thought you were gonna do it in September, so we'll get this out.
Can you email
in
it?
We'll get it out in a week or so.
Okay.
And a reminder that it's August 12th if you're in
Yeah.
your email mode.
Yeah.
August 12th.
Vote, everybody unanimous?
Yeah,
Yeah, there we are.
vote.
All those in
By
favor?
acclamation, actually.
Aye.
No opposition? We're meeting in August.
August 12th.
Who's bringing the hot dogs?
Well, that
Lobster
wasn't
roll.
part of the agreement.
Oh,
All right, so
So are we done for tonight? Do I have a motion
I
to?
move, so move.
Second.
Oh, you are good. All those in favor?
aye.
No opposition.